Okay, so we are recording, I think. Yeah, we are. So we started a new segment in the book of Isaiah, a bunch of chapters that we can group under a certain heading. And what are those chapters about?
Whoa.
Whoa, and what's the repeated word that's used in the chapter?
Oracles?
Oracles. And so we talked a little bit about oracle is not really a word we use all the time. How could you define oracle?
Judgment.
Judgment. Anything else with that? I think I looked it up. I hadn't looked it up before. I think Jasmine had shared something, but
it wasn't as judgmenty as I would have thought.
Okay.
And I can't remember where I wrote it down.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
I did.
I have Strong's definition. So it's a burden, a load, a tribute to be carried, an utterance, a bearing, a doom, and a prophecy.
Okay, that's pretty good. So that idea of burden carrying seems to be very much like what I would feel if I was Isaiah, having to give this word. In fact, I feel like that pretty much every week when I share the news of the world today and what we're in the study. So hang in there, everybody, because we're going to get we have some beautiful bright spots as well. Okay, so we're in a section against these oracles that God had Isaiah share about certain nations. So we watched him giving the same kind of judgment and message to his own people. And then that kind of continues throughout. But now we see this happening with other nations. So in the first one that we talked about last week, it took 2 chapters, 13 and part of 14. Who is the oracle concerning in those chapters?
Babylon.
Babylon. And how would you
of Babylon?
What, Esther?
And the king of Babylon.
And the king of Babylon. So how would you summarize that message, that oracle?
They were going to be destroyed.
Okay.
I put down God's fury and punishment, semicolon, no mercy.
Okay, good. Yes, it's a very complete judgment, and we're supposed to be looking at time things, and haven't always done a good job of trying to ask you guys where you're placing certain things. Within the next couple weeks, I think I found a chart that could be helpful on making a list of the prophecies about the first coming and the prophecies about the second coming. It was helpful to me because I've been sort of not great about, I've been jotting some of them down, but not all of them down. And I haven't really been tracking on a specific list the first coming references. So that's a handout that I'll be sending by email. And I think it'll be a help with that. So in this one, is terms of Babylon, how are we going to look at that prophecy in terms of the prophetic timeline? Near fulfillment. Go ahead, Esther.
To me, it was also a near fulfillment because of the Medes and the Persian, the Medes coming in and destroying Babylon. But it also went well into the future, like into the millennium too. So it was both mountain peaks.
Yeah, it was both. And even what I'm realizing as we look back, even the prophecies about Jesus sometimes fall into both categories as well, right? They talk about his first coming and the second. And that's one of the things I've been doing a little bit more reading, commentators talking about the fact they have a term for it. This idea that as Isaiah writes, he's just writing what he's told and isn't bothering to separate it or by time. It's just all together as if it's one, and then it becomes our job to look and see, well, what already happened and what didn't happen. And sometimes we're dividing verses in half. I think that's literally the case. So good. Anybody want to add anything else about Babylon? All right, nothing's popping out. All right, so we're going to start with chapter 14. We had to finish. There was one little oracle in the I think it's like 5 verses. If somebody would read 14:28 to 32, we'll talk about the next one.
In the year that King Ahaz died, this oracle came. Do not rejoice, O Philistia, all of you, because the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root, a viper will come out, and its fruit will be a flying serpent. Those who are most helpless will eat, and the needy will lie down in security. I will destroy your root with famine, and it will kill off your survivors. Wail, O gate, cry, O city, melt away, O Philistia, for all of you, for the smoke comes from the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks. How then will one answer the messenger of the nations, that the Lord has founded Zion, and the afflicted of his people will seek refuge in it?
Okay, good. So who is this nation again?
Philistia.
Okay, and we would better know them as, this is just bad, my things, I don't want that one there. Okay, I'm gonna have to scoot through the references that you guys looked at, but I wanted to talk about the locations this week because it's really interesting picture by the time we add in all the countries who receive these oracles. And so you can see how close to Judah is this nation. Very close. And you can see there, what's interesting here, the list of cities that our homework already told us, you're going to see these, a lot of these cities referenced. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think on our maps, I'm not sure it was even, maybe on one of them, it was listed in there, but that's where it is. It's that segment right there, right next to it. And what did you learn about this nation when you look at its history in the Bible? And that was on page 96. Some of you probably already know this without looking. When you hear the word Philistines, what do you think?
Goliath.
Okay, so there's one of the history, right? What else did you guys learn?
I thought it was interesting that they were soothsayers, conjurers, spiritism, magic, witchcraft, that kind of idea.
Right, and we got that from what book of the Bible? Like all your cross references
Isaiah.
for Isaiah, for Philistines were in Isaiah, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, good.
But I didn't catch that when we did Isaiah 2.
Yeah, I know.
But I got it now.
I was just thinking in my head that because of some research that I had done before for something else, that Ashkelon is part of Philistia, and in about 70, what was it? Let's see if I still have it up here. No, it was about maybe 74, 73 BC. There was a priest that went in and executed 80 witches there. So it's not something that stopped, when they were destroyed. When it came back, they were still soothsayers and fortune tellers. They were still, it must be something about the area, just brings them back, like Salem.
That's very interesting. Okay, good. So they have been like perpetual enemies of Israel, right? They just always were. And to this day, what's the relationship between that area and Judah and Israel?
Well, Gaza is contested.
It's still the same, right? It's still the same. That's part of the land God gave Israel, but that section is when you hear the world talking about these things, that's part of the contention is right there. So again, that's another place you might want to keep your eye on. So what's the description here in the oracle? It's pretty short. What do you get from looking at what this section says in chapter 14?
I thought it was interesting. In 2 places, it says all of you.
Okay.
It's not like in general, but all of you.
Okay, good.
So
Good to notice that.
It's like, okay, so was the whole people, all Philistines, completely wiped out with none left, since it kept saying all of you?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. That was just interesting.
Yeah. So what do you think in verse 29? That's one of the places it says not to rejoice, all of you. Why? Did you guys understand what was being talked about there?
But what they had us look up was interesting when you got into 2 Kings.
Yeah.
That's where it kind of explains what's going on. Ahaz dies, his son Hezekiah comes in and wipes them out. And so they're rejoicing because Ahaz is dead, but then his son is the one that's going to come in and execute God's judgment on them.
Okay.
At least that's what I got out of it.
Okay. Yeah, I think again, and it depends on who you read or look at, whether this is coming from Israel. I will tell you, if you look at even more cross references, there are also references to another nation. What other nation could this mean as well? But if that's what happened in 2 Kings, then we can look at that one. Yeah. So I would write down one nation and then I'd go, oh, well, this one makes it sound like this nation. Anybody have an idea what other nation it could have been that another king would have died and they would have thought, oh, okay, we're safe now? Assyria and Babylon, right? The Babylonians and the Assyrians, there's another reference. I have down Jeremiah 1 and then Isaiah 34, but I didn't take really good notes there. So, but again, I had both listed, and I think that's why the homework phrased the question the way it did, because these nations do get attacked multiple times. And so it depends on the year that you look at. But in general, that's the idea, right? That don't rejoice because one king is gone, and because the next one who comes is what? How is he compared to the one before?
Worse,
right?
flying,
So
a flying serpent.
Flying serpent out of him. Good. Then what is the final result then? Is what we could take away. There's a couple good words in there about their judgment. What's going to happen?
Famine?
Yes, for those that are yep. Where's it going to come from? The destruction.
The smoke comes from the north?
From the north. And so this is one of the places where they had you start to look. And so who is to the north of them?
Assyria?
Assyria, and also another nation we're going to look at, which is not Judah, but I think Karen said it, but she's
Israel.
muted, so Israel. So again, I know that the other kings line up with Judah, right? But again, but that's the thing. There was constant warfare here, and we can kind of look at this. There's actually a point, though. There's some good news in this section for the future, which is how does this end in verse 32?
Refuge on Zion.
Yes. And when is that going to happen?
I took that to mean during the millennium, during Christ's reign.
Okay, so one of the things that you guys can do here when you start to look at, I know this adds a level of work, if they don't send you, but you look at anything about Mount Zion and refuge, if you go back, you'll find now through the book of Isaiah that all of those references we have, they start to sound very similar. For instance, starting all the way back to Isaiah 2. Verse 14, right? And so that can kind of, again, help you with the time frame of those things. So again, that's one of the points where I would say that that is something that is going to happen later. All right, any other thoughts on that nation or what's going to happen? So even your homework, even told us this time, told you ahead of time that some of these were going to be difficult to understand. And I found them to be so. Like I did a lot of work. I looked at a lot more commentary than I normally do. And read it a lot, studied it a lot. So, but what we can always end up with, you will get the big picture, right? It's pretty hard to miss the overall picture that God is talking about. And so if you're getting that, the details, don't worry too much about them. I will say also, if you've already studied Kings and Chronicles, or if you were to be studying them here, this is a great book to actually also go back and get the history of Israel, because the prophet's talking about the things that were listed in those books. And I haven't done an in-depth study of those, unfortunately. So it's always like, I've read them, but I go, oh, that's right, that happened. I remember that now. Okay, let's move on to chapters 15 and 16. They go together, but they're still just 3 pages. So if I could have 3 people to read, so somebody would read the first page of 15 and then page 1 and 2 of 16. Not their numbers, but. Kim, will you read 15? You can be the brave one on page 1. I believe that's the hardest one, if I remember correctly, in terms of names. Anybody
Names.
want to take the first page of 16? Karen, and then Jasmine, you can take the second page of 16, okay? All right, Kim, whenever you're ready.
The oracle concerning Moab. Surely in a night Ar of Moab is devastated and ruined. Surely in a night Kir of Moab is devastated and ruined. They have gone up to the temple to Dibon, even to the high places to weep. Moab wails over Nebo and Medeba. Everyone's head is bald and every beard is cut off. In their streets they have girded themselves with sackcloth. On their housetops and in their squares everyone is wailing, dissolved in tears. Heshbon and Elealeh also cry out. Their voice is heard all the way to Jahaz. Therefore the armed men of Moab cry aloud. His soul trembles within him. My heart cries out for Moab. His fugitives are as far as Zoar and Eglath Sheliashah. Something like that.
Good job.
Good.
Where they go up to the ascent of Luhith weeping. Surely on the road to Horonaim, they raise a cry of distress over their ruin. For the waters of Nimrim are desolate. Surely the grass is withered, the tender grass died out, there is no green thing. Therefore the abundance which they have acquired and stored up, they carry off over the brook of Arabim. For the cry of distress has gone around the territory of Moab. Its wail goes as far as Eglaim, and its wailing even to Beer Elim. For the waters of Dimon are full of blood. Surely I will bring added woes to Dimon, a lion upon the fugitives of Moab and upon the remnant of the land.
Send the tribute lamb to the ruler of the land, from Selah by way of the wilderness to the mountain of the daughter of Zion. Then, like fleeting birds or scattered nestlings, the daughters of Moab will be at the fords of the Arnon. Give us advice, make a decision, cast your shadow like night at high noon. Hide the outcasts, do not betray the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab stay with you. Be a hiding place to them from the destroyer. For the extortioner has come to an end, destruction has ceased. Oppressors have completely disappeared from the land. A throne will even be established in loving kindness, and a judge will sit on it in faithfulness in the tent of David. Moreover, he will seek justice and be prompt in righteousness. We have heard of the pride of Moab, an excessive pride, even of his arrogance, pride, and fury. His idle boasts are false. Therefore Moab will wail, every one of Moab will wail. You will moan for the raisin cakes of Kir Hareseth, and those who are utterly stricken. For the fields of Heshbon have withered, the vines of Sibmah as well. The lords of the nations have trampled down its choice clusters, which reached as far as Jazer and wandered to the deserts. Its tendrils spread themselves out and passed over the sea.
Therefore, I will weep bitterly for Jazer, for the vine of Sibmah. I will drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh. For the shouting over your summer fruits and your harvest has fallen away. Gladness and joy are taken away from the fruitful field. In the vineyards also, there will be no cries of joy or jubilant shouting. No treader treads out wine in the presses, for I have made the shouting to cease. Therefore, my heart intones like a harp for Moab, and my inward feelings for Kir Hareseth. So it will come about when Moab presents himself, when he wearies himself upon his high place and comes to his sanctuary to pray, that he will not prevail. This is the word which the Lord spoke earlier concerning Moab. But now the Lord speaks, saying, within 3 years, as a hired man would count them, the glory of Moab will be degraded along with all his great population, and his remnant will be very small and impotent.
Okay, so as you read the verses in Isaiah 15 and 16, I lost 15 somehow. That's over here. There are some words that can help you understand their general emotional state. What kind of words do you hear repeatedly in this oracle?
Wails,
Wails, weeping, other words,
cry of distress,
cries. What, Jasmine?
Devastated,
Devastated,
ruined, desolate.
tears, fear, moans. Okay, so I had down that there's 14 different references to some kind of lamenting in this chapter. So pretty much we could just say, okay, well, that's that. We can just go on, right? No, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but not a good thing, right? It's interesting. So historically also, while you guys tell me about the cross references, I'm going to bring up the map so that we can see where Moab is in the area. Should be. Okay, there we go. And this will show a lot of the places we're going to see already. So here's where we put where the Philistines will be. Here's Babylon and Assyria that we talked about last time. And here where the pin is Moab. Now, how close to Judah does Moab look on the map?
Right next door.
Really close. So now you see Judah in between Philistia and Moab. And so this area is just so tight, so close together. So what did you guys learn historically about Moab? Some of you probably didn't even need the cross references. If you've studied Genesis, in particular Genesis part 3 with us, you probably remembered the foundation of Moab, but you went there anyway. So what do you know about Moab?
Lot's daughters got him Lot drunk and slept with him, and the firstborn named her son Moab.
Yeah. So these are this people that came from that. And so that's pretty much been the state in the beginning of that history. Did you learn anything else?
Ruth came from Moab, and she was the great grandmother of David.
Yes. I mean, this picture is so amazing, right? So look at their start. Their start born out of, to me, lack of faith, right? Because who rescued Lot and his daughters from Sodom and Gomorrah?
God.
God. So in one night, his daughters have decided that even though God rescued them, he has no future plan for them and they need to take matters into their own hands, right? That is such a huge lesson for us of what happens when we think God started something, but maybe he doesn't have a plan to finish it, so we'll go help him. But look at that start and then look at what God did with Ruth, right? She was a Moabitess from Moab, which was still an idol worshiping country at her time, brought into the family of Naomi, and God put her in the lineage of Christ. Like, just amazing, right? So cool on both sides of that. But again, did they ever have a very good history in relationship with Judah historically? No, they have just always been another one of the sort of perpetual enemies of Israel. Okay, so we saw it on the map. We saw their history. What's going on in the oracle? So we know that the tone is a lot of lamenting, a lot of wailing and weeping. And why is that?
In a night, Ar and Ker were devastated and ruined.
Okay, so there's devastation and ruin. In the next couple verses, what's the picture if you look at the end of verses 2 and into verse 3?
They're in mourning
Okay,
and
mourning.
humiliation.
Yeah, humiliation and mourning. So which things give you those are the perfect two words to describe that, but those words aren't there. So how did you get that, Kim, from those two verses there?
Having your head bald and your beard shaved off, that's a sign of humiliation. That's what a country might do to the invade, like when they invaded, to humiliate the people of the army and the men of that, without killing them. They do that because it emasculates them. It makes them look like
Okay.
women.
Good. And we already saw one of those references with, remember with Assyria, what happened to the shaving and the razor. So good. Another good reference to that. What about the mourning? What word gives you the clue to mourning?
Sackcloth.
Sackcloth. Yeah. Whenever you see that reference, that's what they would do with mourning. And if you see ashes with that, that's another picture of that. So they're in shame, they're in mourning. What comes next? What else is going on?
To me, that describes widespread destruction. I mean, it hits everywhere.
Okay. Yeah, all these places that Kim had to read for us, right? All of this list of places, all weeping, all wailing. What else do you see about what happens to them? You get down into verses 6 and 7.
Everything that they had stored away and stored up is carried away by the invading army. And then that picture in 9 of the waters of Demon are full of blood. It's like so many are slain, it just turns the water red.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a picture that reminded me of, other end times kind of things. Good. So we see waters desolate, waters full of blood. What about the land?
In
There's
verse 6,
nothing.
it says the grass is withered and the grass is dried out. There's no green thing, so it's gone.
Okay, good. So in 15, we get this picture of the desolation and the weeping. Then we move into 16. The oracle doesn't change, right? There's no new oracle listed. So we know we're still talking about the same place. Then, so what's the first part, like the first 5 verses? What does it seem like is happening in those first 5 verses? Because of their devastation.
They're looking for somewhere safe to stay.
Yeah, and who do they go? Who are they at least talking to about that possibility?
They're at the fords of the Arnon.
Yeah, that's where they end up going. But at first in verse 1, it says they send a tribute to whom?
The daughter of Zion.
Yeah, the mountain of the daughter of Zion. And they're asking for counsel and advice, right? And they want what Karen has said. They're looking for, what are the words that could tell you what they're looking for?
Shelter, refuge?
Yep. Good.
Hiding place.
Yes. And then we have one of these interesting phrases thrown in there in verse 5. What's being talked about in verse 5?
Is it like meant to be an encouragement? Like, don't worry, something good will come of this?
Yeah, I think so. Again, when you're looking at trying to keep track of who's speaking and who's not, you notice that in verses 3 and 4, there's quotations, right? And that's these daughters of Moab looking for this counsel and hiding place. When you get to the second part of verse 4, and the 4 is speaking, that's back to Isaiah, right? Isaiah is speaking and talking about a time when the extortioners and oppressors have disappeared from the land, and then what will happen according to verse 5?
That lineage, that it has something, it has a place to begin, or throughout there.
Okay, and what lineage are we talking about, B?
David?
Okay, So what's going to happen in regards to David? According to that verse.
Well, the judge, is he prophesying Jesus?
Mhm. Yeah, on what? Because how do we know what's happening here? What's going to be established?
The
The
throne.
throne is going to be established.
A throne with a judge who sits on it in faithfulness in the tent of David. So again, in the reference to the lineage, and what's he going to do, this judge? He's going to seek,
Justice.
and he'll be prompt in
Righteousness.
righteousness. So if this is a reference to Jesus, which it sounds like it, at what point in the prophetic picture are we talking about in verse 5? First coming or second coming?
Second coming.
Second coming, because did Jesus sit on any throne when he came the first time? No. He might have been seeking justice and being prompt in righteousness, but he was not at that time. Any of those pictures of Jesus on a throne ruling, you can pretty much go, well, that did not happen the first time. It must go with the second time. So that would be a place to at least start. Okay, good. So in the midst of this despair and destruction, Isaiah reminds these people, it seems like to Moab, well, yes, there's going to be a day when this is going to happen. But then we see what the judgment is for. So again, if you're watching your fors and your therefores, you will be reminded of why God is allowing this to happen. What do we know about Moab that we get a therefore in verse 7? Therefore the wailing. But verse 6 tells us why.
Excessive pride and arrogance.
Yes. So have we seen those words before in regard to God judging nation?
Yes.
Yes, including his own, right? This has become the repeated sort of pattern. So if you're looking at nations and why God might be judging them, again, it's them looking to their own pride and their own selves instead of to him. Yeah, Kim?
That does not bode well for us. We're going to make an application.
Yes, let's have some application again, which is the point, and the homework keeps asking you. Again, written 6 years ago, they'd probably going, boy, we didn't even know what we were talking about until we got to 2021. Yes, arrogance, pride, false boasting, and a nation forgetting God, as we will see in here. Good. So again, now here's more destruction or description of what the destruction will be like. So what else do you learn in these verses, starting there in 7 and 8?
Well, 7 describes the people's response of wailing, moaning, and being utterly stricken, and 8 describes the earth or their living place of being withered and trampled down and desert. And
Okay, good. Good. If we continue, then there's another therefore, and our homework kind of had us notice these phrases. So there's a response by someone else. Therefore I will weep, and I have made, and I will drench you with my tears, and my heart intones. So when we look at that, who is speaking, by the way? Who do we need to remember has been speaking all of these chapters, except for when somebody else is speaking back to him?
Isaiah.
Isaiah. So we know for sure, right? If you see I or my, it is probably going to refer to Isaiah. Do you think anyone else is also speaking here? And how do you know for sure that that's him?
I was kind of thinking it's a combination of Isaiah and God.
Okay.
Isaiah is probably not capable himself of causing shouting to cease and certain other things that this talks about. And then in 13, he says, this is the word which the Lord spoke earlier concerning Moab. So that pointed me kind of back towards, I think he's bouncing back and forth a little bit of his own feelings and what God is saying too.
Yeah, those were the clue passages that I used as well. And like, well, of course, Isaiah is speaking. And if you're the prophet having to give these words, by the way, if you feel weary sometimes, which I do, we talked about that in the early part of this study, which is such a hard word, and the time we're in, and then looking at the news of the world. If you ever feel weary, just remember Isaiah, who's got 50 more chapters of this to do, right? We're only in 16 and he's got 50 more. So I'm really like feeling how just speaking for God that way, what a challenge. So yeah, that was those were my two clue passages. Anybody else? Is that how you guys answered that, or what did you think?
That makes total sense. I mean,
Yeah.
I put it first as God, and then I'm going like, it also sounds very much like a human response. So
Yeah. So, and that's hard to know when it's a prophet speaking and we know they're speaking the words for God. But so you could have both, but for sure there are places where, as Jasmine interpreted, I think anyway, the end of verse 10 perfectly, for I have made the shouting to cease. That's a role of God, right? Only God is doing that. And then again, in verse 13, if you still weren't sure, this is the word which the Lord spoke earlier concerning Moab. So Isaiah is reminding us, these are the words of God. Then he says, the Lord spoke some of this earlier, but now the Lord speaks saying what? What's the point of the last part about Moab's oracle there?
Within 3 years, the glory of Moab will be degraded, along with all his great population, and his remnant will be very small. And
Okay,
impotent.
so we know that there won't be many people left at the end of this destruction. Does anybody have any insight? Or I didn't spend a lot of time in this place trying to judge the timing, because again, this is one of those places where depending on who you're reading, you'll read a bunch of them. Some of them will just completely say the Bible's wrong. Some of them will try to make the Bible fit it. Some of them will get years. And I always just go, okay, well, that's what he said. Anybody have any insight on that or want to ask or talk about it?
The only thing I just wanted to mention was that Moab today is Jordan, which, you know, again, it's fits in with future times and past times and all that, and that this relationship is something we need to watch.
Yes. I do have a date. I don't know how it lines up with the 3 years, but somebody did say that 722 BC might have been a point where this devastation did happen once. Again, as you look at the maps and this surrounding of this, especially those of you who I know are in Barb and Esther that are in Revelation part 4 right now, and have probably already seen in the other 3, as a lot of us have, that in the end as well, even though all of these nations, actually these things did happen, when you look at that Ezekiel war that's coming, or for those of you who've also studied Ezekiel, there's going to be a day where Jesus is going to return and all these nations are going to be judged again, right? If they remained enemies of Israel, they're going to go through judgment again. So you could have near and far, I think, for all of them, probably, if it's already happened, it's probably going to happen again. And that's why that map is important. And if you read, again, the Z's, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Joel, Amos, you can still see them listed in this destruction of when the Lord comes and stands on the Mount of Olives and some of those things that are going to happen. If you've got that much studying time, you can read all the cross references in your Bible about all these verses and you'll learn a lot, but it's hard to track. Okay, anything else about Moab? But yeah, that's who's there now. It's in the area where Jordan is. Good call. Okay, let's go to Damascus in Isaiah 17. And do we want to read? No, 18 changes. So it's 2 pages. If I could get 2 readers for Isaiah 17.
I'll read.
Okay, B and then Melinda. Okay.
Okay, the oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus is about to be removed from being a city and will become a fallen ruin. The cities of Aurora are forsaken. They will be for flocks to lie down in, and there will be no one to frighten them. The fortified city will disappear from Ephraim, and sovereignty from Damascus, and the remnant of Aram. They will be like the glory of the sons of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. Now in that day the glory of Jacob will fade, and the fatness of his flesh will become lean. It will be even like the reaper gathering the standing grain, as his arm harvests the ears. Or it will be like one gleaning ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Yet gleanings will be left in it like the shaking of an olive tree, 2 or 3 olives on the topmost bough, 4 or 5 on the branches of a fruitful tree, declares the Lord, the God of Israel. In that day, man will have regard for his Maker, and his eyes will look to the Holy One of Israel. He will not have regard for the altars, the work of his hands, nor will he look to that to have made, even the Asherim and incense stands.
In that day, their strong cities will be like forsaken places in the forest, or like branches which they abandoned before the sons of Israel, and the land will be a desolation. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, you plant delightful plants and set them with vine slips of a strange God. In that day, you will plant it, you carefully fence it in, and in the morning you bring your seed to blossom, but the harvest will be a heap in a day of sickliness and incurable pain. Alas, the uproar of many peoples, who roar like the roaring of the seas and the rumbling of the nations, who rush on like the rumbling of mighty waters. The nations rumble on like the rumbling of many waters, but he will rebuke them and they will flee far away and be chased like chaff in the mountains before the wind, or like whirling dust before a gale. At evening time, behold, there is terror. Before morning, they are no more. Such will be the portion of those who plunder us and the lot of those who pillage us.
Okay, good. Again, if you follow pronouns, it can also be helpful going back and forth of who's talking. And by the end there, that definitely helps. Okay, so this chapter is interesting because we start with an oracle for another nation, but who also becomes actually even more of a focus in chapter 17. So we know this is concerning Damascus, but who else is included in this, which reminds us of chapters we've already studied in Isaiah, back to chapter 7 for sure.
Israel.
Yeah, Israel, the northern part, right? Ephraim, remember the divided Israel here. And we know that because of the description in 1 through 3, you see that listed, right? And what do you remember from those chapters before? What's the connection between Damascus and Ephraim? You guys went
They
there.
colluded together.
Yes, they colluded together. We had that back in Isaiah 7, right? Is that the chapter when God was warning them about not fearing those two nations? These are the two nations God told Ahaz not to fear. So you still see this alliance. Because Israel did not leave that alliance, did not support their own people, they're going to be included in this judgment. In fact, the focus is way more on them than it is on Damascus. So let's talk about the part that is about Damascus. What do you learn about this oracle for them?
That they're going to be destroyed. They'll be like a fallen ruin and forsaken.
Yeah, how quickly is it going to happen when it happens? What's it say? Oh, never mind. My brain's back on another one. So I could bring up the map that actually has more pinpoints on it, but you can see it on here. You guys see where Damascus is? In Syria, right above now above Judah, also to the north of Israel, but closer to Israel, right? So this is Damascus right in there on the screen. So look at the picture of the surrounding of Judah and Israel when you start to add in all these nations. Anybody know, has this event happened? Has Damascus ever been completely removed from being a city?
No.
No. Damascus is actually listed, I saw it in more than one place. It's considered to be the longest recorded city in the world of being continually inhabited. So this is the event I was kind of saying is coming, right? This is the one to watch for. And what I would say is, if you see this happen, like if you wake up and one day Damascus is blown off the face of the earth, you better start talking to your people in a hurry, because this is the event that, depending on, you know, again, there's a wide range of study, but a lot of the commentators in the prophetic world agree that this event, when it happens, could be the starting point for then the next things that are going to happen. So the Ezekiel war, and then Jesus coming back in one way or another. Rapture, possibly his second return. Again, depending on whatever frame you land on in those things, this event will be world shaking, right? Because that's a big deal. And so people will say it's not possible. Is it possible? Yeah. I mean, if you think back to what happened to Beirut just recently, that was very close to a very similar thing. All it takes is something like that and a bigger. Or again, in our news last week, what had just happened in Damascus? They were bombed by Israel. Israel bombed them, and the week before that, we did a retaliation on the other side of Syria. So this is why it's really key. You do want to know what's going on. So when I realized where we were in Isaiah, and this stuff is literally happening in Damascus right now, I just kind of went, oh boy, God. Okay. What else do you know about them? We start to see the connection here with this other nation. In verses 1-3 still. It looks good at first, right? Like I thought this is kind of weird, because verse 3 seemed sort of positive, not at first, and then it did, because they will be like the glory of the sons of Israel. But then you go to verse 4, and what do you learn about the glory of the sons of Israel?
Gonna fade.
It's going to fade, right? So at first I was a bit confused in verse 3, and I was like, oh, okay, wait, okay, I see. It's this connection. And this is where my homework helped me, by going to those questions about, what do you know about these nations? What happened? How are they aligned? All of that. Okay. So what do we start to learn? So now in verse 4, who is the focus for the rest of this chapter?
Israel.
In that day, the glory of Jacob will fade. Jacob is another word for Israel. So again, in that day, his glory is going to fade. There's a bunch of different descriptions listed here in the very next sets of verses. So in verse 4, right there, it says, the fatness of his flesh will become lean. What does that say to you?
Famine.
Famine or sickness. And then the next verses would tell you why, or describe the famine. What do you see about harvest in verses 5 and 6?
There's not going to be much of anything left.
Not much, right? So how many olives left on the olive tree? Or 6?
2 or 3.
2 or 3 on the topmost bough, maybe 4 or 5 on the branches if it's a really fruitful tree, right? That is not a lot of olives, I don't think, for an olive tree. So a small harvest is the picture. Then we jump back into an interesting time frame when this happens. So in that day, whatever day it is, it's still the day being referred to in verses 4 to 6. What else do we learn?
They'll turn to the Lord.
Okay. What are the 2 words used there for God?
Have regard.
Yeah, regard for
His maker,
his maker, and he'll look to
Holy One of Israel.
the Holy One of Israel. So we have that reference again, the Holy One of Israel. So when is this day going to happen? Jasmine, you're muted.
It's the future second coming.
Second coming, right? Because that's when we know that there's going to be a day coming where they will have regard. And then verse 8 gives you the other clue to that, because what won't they have regard for any longer?
Themselves and what they've made.
Which is what? What have they made?
Their
Idols.
altars and idols.
Yeah. So their altars and their idols, they'll no longer have regard for. And that's pretty much something we know. Have any of us ever always completely gotten rid of all of our idols, including Israel? Did they ever really get rid of their idols? No. That's one of the reasons why they ended up where they did. So then you see more description about their cities and their places. What will that be like? And you can again see the reference to Israel. And again, Damascus too, in a certain way, because there is a connection, but you also want to see this in terms of, Israel is being spoken of when you get to verse 10. So what's this destruction or picture like?
Abandoned, and land will be desolated.
Okay, good. Again, that land of desolation. And in verse 10, you get a very important reason why. What have they done in the nation of Israel?
Forsaken God.
Forsaken God. You see the words forgotten, the God of your salvation. Remember, that's what Isaiah's name means. And not remembered.
The rock of your refuge.
The rock of your refuge. We talk about salvation. We talk about a rock, so do we remember that? This is a judgment of God. Where do you go? Who do you turn to? This judgment going against Israel, they're connected in alliance to whom? To God or to another nation?
Another nation.
Another nation. So just like the kings of Judah, the kings of the northern kingdom also allianced themselves with nations that were not godly nations. They didn't rely on God. They made alliances and treaties and covenants with people again and against their own other brothers in the faith, really, for us, and their other people of Israel. And this is why I think the questions this week I thought were interesting in terms of application. Where do we turn to? Where do you turn to? Are we living every day in remembrance of the God of our salvation and the rock of our refuge? Or in these times, are we tempted to go to the world and to look like the world? And have we searched every place within us, everything that we do on a daily level? They kind of asked you, are there any places daily where maybe we're not looking like the people of God? That would be where I was trying to think, why those questions this week? And I think it's this verse in 17. All right, what's the final picture in verses 10 and 11 of the destruction before we talk about what God will do?
It's a very interesting picture. They planted plants and vine slips just made the plants grow and worked it, of a strange God. And that's an interesting picture, because there's other places where we're God's planting in the house of the Lord. That's later in Isaiah. But carefully fenced it in, but the harvest is going to be a heap and sickliness and incurable pain. It's like, why are you doing this?
Yeah. So again, that whatever they do, they're planting, they're trying to plant their own plants, do these things, and the harvest will be nothing but a heap and sickliness and pain. Okay, verse 12, alas. So what's this section about? 12 to 14.
I had to laugh because I looked up alas, and the word is H-O-Y, and all I could hear is oi.
Yes, right.
Oi, therefore many people.
Yes, that is the word here. That's the Jewish word that you might be familiar with if you've heard that. So that is what it is. And what is the alas for? What is the oi for here?
The uproar of many people.
Yeah, and then if I don't remember if they had you mark nations here, but I always mark nations.
Yeah.
You see it twice here. You see this rumbling of the nations, the uproar of the many people. What is their sound like?
Many waters.
Mighty waters, roaring of the seas, rumbling of many waters. So lots of noise, lots of nations, lots of people coming against whom? God's people, right? So Israel, that's who's saying alas, that's who's saying oi here, or Isaiah is. So here's this rumbling of many nations, but what will happen?
He's going to rebuke them and they'll turn tail and flee.
Yeah, good. They'll flee. Go ahead.
Before morning.
Yeah,
Only for
interesting, right?
a short season. Before morning, they're no more.
Yeah, at night there's terror, before morning they're gone. Again, they'll be like chaff in the wind. And then if you're having trouble tracking, what does the last sentence say? And Isaiah is the one speaking. What does it say? Such will be the portion of those who plunder
Us.
and the lot of those who pillage us. So again, this reminder that nations will come, nations will make plans, but God was not going to allow them to go beyond what his plan is for his people. Questions, thoughts on Damascus? Y'all just want to skip 18?
Yes, please.
Because that's what I thought too. I was like, okay, well, this was a struggle, but I got there, and then I got to 18 and went, holy, that's what I said. I said alas, just like they did. Alas. Okay. Well, let's go there with a little bit of help. I was able to make some sense. Go ahead, Kim.
Just the idea in 13 that the nations rumble on like the waters, but he will rebuke them. They flee away before the wind. And the wind there is that ruach, which is another word for God's Holy Spirit and his breath.
Good. Thank you for that.
The one after that, the gale later on, which I would have thought was more like a wind too. It's a different word, different thing. So it's like, I really got the idea that this is God. He's using his power to make it work, not just another power. He's not going to call on the nations.
Okay.
It's something he does.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. I love that. Thank you. Thank you for adding that. Okay. Well, would somebody, the easy part here is the reading of 18 verses 1 through 7. If somebody would do that for us. Let's see. Does anybody want to read who hasn't read?
I can.
Barb?
Alas, O land of warring wings, which lies beyond the rivers of Cush, which sends its envoys by the sea, even in papyrus vessels on the surface of the waters. Go, swift messengers, to a nation tall and smooth, to a people fear far and wide, a powerful and oppressive nation, whose land the rivers divide. All you inhabitants of the world and dwellers on earth, as soon as a standard is raised on the mountains, you will see it. And as soon as the trumpet is blown, you will hear it. For thus the Lord has told me, I will look from my dwelling place quietly, like dazzling heat in the sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest. For before the harvest, as soon as the bud blossoms and the flower becomes a ripening grape, then he will cut off the sprigs with pruning knives and remove and cut away the spreading branches. They will be left together for mountain birds of prey and for the beasts of the earth. And the birds of prey will spend the summer feeding on them, and all the beasts of the earth will spend harvest time on them. At that time, a gift of homage will be brought to the Lord God, Lord of hosts, from a people tall and smooth, even from a people feared far and wide, a powerful and oppressive nation, whose land the rivers divide, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, even Mount Zion.
Okay, good. So let's start with where we have been, which is, what do you know about Cush, and where was it, or where is it? It doesn't fit. I don't think they put it on either one of your maps, but I have one I think I can show you.
Way down south.
Yes, south in regard to where, Karen?
Judah and Israel. It was like at the
Yes.
base of the Red Sea, I think.
Yeah, if you can look at these two maps combined, you can see where we've been over in here. There's Judah, here's Egypt over here, there's Cush, and you can see it blown up here. So yeah, over here and then south. So it's a little farther away. And what did you learn? If you didn't know what it's called today, my Bible in the cross references actually said what it is. What nation is it called today? It's not called Cush anymore. It still exists, but
Ethiopia.
Ethiopia. Okay, good. So for me, the confusion started right away when it said a land beyond the rivers of Cush. So I thought, are they talking about a land beyond Cush or Cush itself? So what are we talking about? Cush itself, right? It is Ethiopia is who this is toward. I'm going to make a jump to verse 7. When we go to verse 7, at that time, which gives us the time for this, one of the fulfillments of this, what time frame is verse 7? Prophetic time frame.
That's the Millennial Kingdom.
That's the Millennial Kingdom, right? An homage, a gift of homage brought to the Lord of hosts and at Mount Zion, right? So when you get that, you see that that is a reference to that. Now, again, there could have been a near fulfillment as well, but notice in every one of these, I think we have a reference to a future event as well. So what did you learn, or what do you know about this oracle? Although it didn't use the word, it says alas, but what do you know about Cush here? What's going on? What's the picture in verse 2?
That they're a powerful and prosperous nation.
Okay. What activity are they seeming to be engaged in here?
Sending envoys.
Okay, so there's a lot of busyness here of looking for something, right? There's a lot of activity, and it's also in verse 1, this land of whirring wings seems to maybe be a reference to that, but also something else. Anybody look at any of that? Insects, maybe it's a nation known for like an insect population, but also I saw that it's a reference to this sort of frantic activity that they have going on in this sending messengers things. Who's included by the time we get to verse 3 beyond Cush?
The nation tall and smooth.
Okay, that is a reference to them, those people. When we get to verse 3, who is added to the nation of Cush in this judgment or in this oracle?
All the
Everyone.
inhabitants.
All inhabitants of the world and dwellers on the earth. And what is this focus? As soon as, right? There's some time frames there. As soon as what?
As soon as a standard is raised on the mountains and as soon as the trumpet is blown, you'll
Okay,
see it
what?
and you'll hear it.
Okay, good. What's a standard?
Flag.
A flag or a banner, right? So what reference do you think that is to? Again, prophetically, what time frame do you think we're talking about?
The kingdom.
That same thing.
Second coming.
Kingdom to come, yes. And the Lord has told Isaiah, what's God doing? What's the picture in verse 4? Jim?
I after listening, I was listening to Jack Hibbs's talk on this too, and I just got this image of God just sitting back, going, watching, just gonna watch,
Just
sitting back.
watching.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sitting on my quiet place, in my dwelling place, quietly. But you know, at that point, but then you know, he's removing his covering, and after that, it just gets nasty.
Yeah. Yeah. The pictures there, how nasty does it get in verses 5 and 6?
It's you know, nothing comes to bud. It's, you know, nothing survives. The crops are premature, everything gets eaten. And what was interesting was that dazzling heat in 4 is the
Yeah.
idea of a sweltering, burning, just devastating heat. And the dew and the heat of the harvest, that ruins the crops. If there's dew on the harvest, it makes mold and destroys the crops. Because I thought,
Yeah.
oh, a cloud of dew, it will feed it. No, it's horrible. At harvest time, you don't want that because it molds the food.
Yeah, I didn't realize that either until I did some looking. Because I just thought, oh, that's nice. God's going to be like dazzling heat in the sunshine and cloud of dew. And I went, no, not dazzling. I have a feeling if we look at the word, which I did not, probably means something not as pretty as dazzling, but I didn't look. If anybody wants to look that up, what's going to happen then to the people, this being cut off, even though it's talking about harvest, it's also talking about the people, right? He will cut them off, and what will happen to them?
The birds of the prey and the beasts of the earth are going to feed on them. Kind of
Yeah.
gives you a picture of Revelation.
Yes, that did remind me very much of that chapter that we all just loved about the birds eating the people left over. Yeah. So that's the picture, and then the repeated verse in 7 with the time frame of at the Mount Zion, a time where people will bring a gift of homage to the Lord. They will recognize who he is. We got just right done. Questions or thoughts or insights on any of this?
That, let me see if I can find it again, because I looked at 2 different places and now I can't find it. Oh, that idea of smooth, the nation tall and smooth. The smooth word can be obstinate or independent.
Okay.
Another word that, and it's like from the sermon I was listening to, he said it was kind of like a developed or independent advanced culture, I thought.
Yeah.
And no one knows. No one knows who this is. They got no idea.
So yeah, so there are a lot of questions. So again, if you felt like this chapter was hard or these chapters are hard, they are, like, they just are. So don't feel like you're just not getting it. They are just hard. But again, do we get the big picture? If you got the big picture of this list of nations and oracles, then you're getting the picture. And if you're getting the time frames, those are the things. What are the people like? Are they following God or not following God? Are they being judged? If they're being judged, do you see why? And do you see when? So that you can tie it in to the biblical picture of what's going to happen. And if you get those things, even if you don't get them till class time, then you're getting as much as anybody else. So that's pretty much the gist of that. I did see that if it refers to Ethiopia, that apparently at least then they were considered also to be people tall. They were a very tall people group. So there is some reference to that possibly as well. But yeah, another nation dealing with them from farther away. All right, other thoughts or questions on those? So hang in there. I think your homework even used our word. We've been saying hang in there is the word for, well, it was the word for 2020. Now it's hanging in there for 2021. Hanging in there. Even your homework used it, right? Hangeth thou in there.
Yeah.
So again, we do get to see God keeping promises and talking about restoration, even through that. You know, do you love the way that he leaves a way, right? He promises a way, and we can just keep grabbing onto that hope that he didn't say, I'm not ever going to give any of you a chance, including the nations that didn't know them. If any of those nations had turned to him, would he have taken them? Biblically, yeah, the Bible says clearly, even in the Old Testament, that if they would follow him, remember that was one of the reasons why Israel was to look the way it did. Israel was to be that thing that drew people to God. And you could even see in the Old Testament that when people would say to Israel, they'd go for protection back before all this and say, we see that the Lord is with you. Can we make a treaty with you? Will you do this? Because we know the Lord is with you. Now, I don't think for the most part they ever turned to him, but they did see his presence. And that was sort of the point. And that's the point for us too, right? That we want people to see that God is with us, that it's fruitful in our lives. It can be fruitful in their lives, that in darkness, there can be hope and there can be light. Any other thoughts or questions or impact or insight that you got from these? Sometimes it's a little bit harder. You can always go back if you're struggling with application or insight, go back to those questions they ask you on the first page, which this week were, who is your trust in ultimately? And what does your day-to-day living say to others about whom you trust, or what would it say to God? And do you live it out consistently, what you believe? Now, we're all going to have our moments, right? We're going to have our moments of doubt. But we don't want to live in that. And we also don't want to follow lies like the ones we talked about earlier with churches promoting a false God and taking away the value of the word, which is where you're going to find all of this hope and comfort and promise. If that gets taken away from you, what do you have left? And that's what gets me so worked up about those things, is that I know that those people are offering people actually nothing. They're not really offering them anything that they can't find in a self-help book on a shelf. And we all know that those will only work for you so far without God's healing. So anyway.
I also really, in application, thought about, we see again and again, God's watch out. God cares for his people. If there is injustice, he will handle it. I mean, it says it in the New Testament too, but God takes care of his people. That brings me great peace, because I don't know what the world holds for me as a Christian, but I do know the one that cares for me, and he cares. He cares. It's obvious throughout Isaiah. We see it again and again.
Yes, he cared for those people. Again, so is that promise that he makes to his people repeatedly in Isaiah and the Old Testament and the New, is that important to us, that God keeps his promise to Israel?
Mhm.
Yes, that is another red flag, by the way. I think we've talked about it. And this isn't new for me to talk about this. Covenant was the first study I ever led. And from that moment on, I've seen the promises that God has made to his people, Israel. And if he doesn't keep that promise to them, why would I trust him to keep any promises to me? But there's a whole group of people that don't believe that Israel lost their promises from God.
Mhm.
And we get them all. Oh yeah, it's called replacement theology. You can look
Wow.
that up. Yeah. that the church has replaced Israel in God's favor, in God's eyes. So that the word for Israel after a certain point is symbolic, and we're supposed to substitute the word church. Now, who made that decision and what verse they made it in, I don't really know. But so how, my question is, well, then how do I know? How do I know when to do that and when not to do that? That's the problem with the symbolic, right? Anyway, God's promises hold true, and I'm going to stand on that word because that's what he says, right? So I'm going to stick as close as I can to what he says. And if I err because I stick to what he says, I'm going to believe he's got grace for me in that. If I change his word or tell people it's not his word, then I think I'm going to be in trouble. So I'm not going to do that. So, all right. I didn't preview the chapters, but I did look. The homework's about the same length, and it covers about as many chapters. So you can see that even though there's a lot of oracles and a lot of chapters, they do move through fairly quickly. So I can't really warn you about how hard or easy they're going to be, but you can see we can get through them, and you're probably getting what you're supposed to get. So keep moving and keep looking for the hope and the light and the promises of God.
Amen.
Amen. All right, we are going to move on to prayer time then, if you guys are ready for that.